So I convened this meeting with people here from around the state and people on Zoom from around the state because, well, two reasons. One, the petitioning begins in April. We were the only campaign to successfully get on the ballot in the state of New York as a minor party or independent campaign against the outrageous 45,000 signature requirement, turning in 66,000, and many people in this room were part of that. We really caught them off guard. The intent was for no one to get on the ballot, and as people know, the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, crashed against the rocks and could not get on the ballot, even though in the case of the Libertarian Party, they've existed for 50 years, won 107 races in the state of New York for local office. I don't know the records for the Green Party, but it's similar. And you can see that this is a way in which the American people are disenfranchised before the election even occurs. You don't have to wait until your vote is stolen. They are stealing your candidates. And we saw that also. I was glad that Robert Kennedy Jr. described publicly what was going on with the Democratic National Committee, because my mentor, Lyndon LaRouche, experienced this, as did I and my husband and others of us who worked on his campaigns, where we discovered that the Democratic National Committee believes it is a private club and the highest court of the land will uphold that. And we had a case in 1996 where Lyndon LaRouche got over 15% of the vote in a number of congressional districts. And that, according to the DNC bylaws, entitles you to a delegate to their convention. But they said, we don't recognize LaRouche as a bona fide Democrat. Never mind that tens of thousands of Democrats had voted for him. So they said, we will not seat you. And then we filed a class action lawsuit. I was in the courtroom in Washington in a federal court where the judge said to the lawyer for Donald Fowler of the DNC, and this is the judge, isn't it the case if the Democratic Party wanted to be for white men only, you could do that? And the lawyer for the Democratic Party said yes. So if you wonder why the Democratic Party is carrying the banner of fascism in this country right now, we had our experience with that earlier. And the Republican Party is not much better. And you can see it from this sorry crop of candidates they put forward. So the front-running candidates, as Dennis said, are Donald Trump, a maverick, who they've tried to destroy, and Robert Kennedy Jr., who they already told they would not count his vote, so he left the party. He could not get them to change the rules. Just because the party establishment doesn't like these candidates does not mean that they are qualified to be president of the United States at this time. That's the challenge. And we have to create a movement that creates a presidency. And I have to tell you very starkly that I am not certain that we are going to make it. And I don't mean my campaign. I mean the nation. I mean civilization. Everything that Lyndon LaRouche warned about in the 70s and 80s, for which he was called political extremist, fringe candidate, and all of the names they called him, the collapse he warned about is occurring. And that is the backdrop for everything we are experiencing. Why is it so easy for them to pit the American people against each other in an insane fashion? And we saw this when Trump won with the Trump derangement syndrome, where people said they had to go to safe rooms or whatever. And then they had our nation has gone mad. you realize they had the women against Trump wearing those pink vagina hats. And then they said they can't wear the vagina hats anymore because everyone who identifies as a woman may not have a vagina. I mean, this is, so the problem that our enemies have is that they cannot win. Their system goes against natural law. But the problem that we have is that the American people, and I would say this is the biggest problem in the world, and I'll get to some of the specifics. The biggest problem in the world right now is that the United States has lost its identity. That is the #1 problem in the world. Because if we knew who we were, we would be cheering what is happening with the BRICS plus nations. We would be saying colonialism is dead. Congratulations for kicking the French military out of various African nations. We would be working with China to develop Haiti, for example, which is a drug transshipment point, a sister republic which should be working with the United States, and it's being ground to shreds. And 80% of the population there depends on burning charcoal for fuel. So the biggest problem we face is that the United States doesn't know who it is and why we were founded. And that's what my campaign is dedicated to. And from New York, that's particularly important because after all, Alexander Hamilton was working from here, Gouverneur Morris, John Jay, George Washington was sworn in Federal Hall in Manhattan. The battles of Saratoga. This state is critical. The Federalist Papers were circulated and studied in this state. And we have people now, we have a silly commission that's been formed because the sesquicentennial, that is the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, is coming up in 2026. And New York has a commission which has been formed, and they're in a pickle because they can't decide if we should really celebrate the founding of the Republic, because maybe it wasn't a good thing, and maybe we should just commemorate it, because maybe it wasn't so good to defeat the British Empire. In fact, maybe we really are the British Empire. So now, what was I saying about the population? The population of this nation and the West has been looted and looted and looted. And Lyndon LaRouche warned in 1971, when Nixon decoupled the dollar from the gold reserve system, that that was the end, not only of the Bretton Woods system, but he had warned earlier about the rock, drug, sex counterculture, the post-industrial society, the environmentalism, that you were going to see a collapse. And when communism collapsed and the Berlin Wall came down, in no small part due to Lyndon LaRouche's collaboration with President Ronald Reagan, he and his wife warned, don't think the British liberal free trade system is successful because the communist system failed. The British liberal free trade system is totally 100% bankrupt. What did that decoupling the dollar from gold allow to occur? It allowed us to have this spectacular bubble of gambling debt held by the City of London and Wall Street, quadrillions of dollars. We can't even imagine that. I can't even really imagine a trillion. This is thousands of trillions of dollars of debt, more than the whole world GDP, over and over. And these people are holding this. And guess what? Has anyone ever seen a bubble that lasted forever? Everyone here has played with soap bubbles. Did you ever have a soap bubble that you still have? No, this thing is going to crash. So they are looking for the last little bit that they can loot. And guess who gets to pay it? We do. and your next door neighbor. So people their property taxes are through the ceiling. The tolls when you cross the George Washington Bridge, your parking tickets, your speeding tickets, and oh, that's supposed to go for building infrastructure, right? Our property taxes go for the schools. Well, how are your schools? How are they doing? How are the roads? Anyone driven through Buffalo lately? How about Syracuse? We can go downtown and see how the roads in Syracuse are. How about that great new maglev train we have from Brookhaven to Buffalo? Oh yeah, we don't have it, do we? We have 3 train derailments every 24 hours in the United States right now. And we, the people, pay for it. So what does that lead to? It leads to incredible stress. It leads to Americans seeing their neighbor as their enemy. So how many instances, we had a few just recently where some young man was driving to pick someone up, goes to the wrong house and gets shot to death. Or someone gets upset because the next door neighbor's kid is playing with a basketball in the wrong place and they run out with a shovel and beat them, or whatever it is. There's this incredible edginess. Anyone seen road rage lately? Yes. And we have it's not just legalization of pot, it is full on commercialization, pushing drug addiction. So people are increasingly psychotic, disoriented, not in control of their emotions. And this leads to other drugs, contrary to the lies. It is a gateway drug. And Chuck Schumer and these other people, don't worry, they want to legalize all of them, the whole thing. And I don't just mean legalize, I mean commercialize. So you have people who are impaired. Their judgment is impaired. And then you have law enforcement. How are they supposed to deal? And since 1958, the state of New York and the nation shut down 90% of our inpatient psychiatric beds. Now, it's true that the mental health system, because these institutions had a lot of power and people could be admitted against their will, it's true that there was some abuse in the system. But I guess the American people are extremists because we watched One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and then we said, oh, let's get everyone out of the hospitals. They'll all do better in group homes. Well, guess where they are now? In the prisons or on the streets. How many people have been pushed in front of trains in New York City? And there's nowhere to put them, because we place no value on the creative potential of every single person in this nation and on this planet. So everyone is already on edge because you're living in a society which is insane, where one car accident, one medical emergency will push you into homelessness. And then you have these wars, and you see it the most extremely. We talked about the situation in Ukraine. Well, that started actually quite long ago, but we can go back to Obama. We can thank him for that, and Victoria Nuland, and the $5 billion that were used to overthrow the elected government of Ukraine and put in a pro-Nazi regime. And then Putin's, fast forward to 2021, December, where Putin sent no less than 3 different treaty proposals to Biden, NATO, and the UK, saying, we cannot have a nuclear armed Ukraine on our border. Ukraine is closer to Russia than Cuba is to Florida. Does not take genius to know that this is a problem. And Biden and NATO and the UK gave Putin the middle finger. And then everyone remembers Biden saying, Putin is going to invade Ukraine on February, and I think he said the 22nd. And I was thinking, how can you possibly know which day the invasion is going to occur? And then what became clear was the Ukrainian army, which we had been training for 8 years since Obama overthrew their government, infested with Nazis, this Azov battalion, and people who wear swastikas and pictures of Adolf Hitler. And it's not just me. The Associated Press admitted when they're covering the Ukrainian army, they ask people, oh, could you please cover that swastika if we're going to put this coverage to the West? So what happens? On the day that Biden said, the Ukrainian army, which is massed against the Donbass, drops 1,600 shells on Donetsk in one day. And Putin had said one of his red lines was ethnic cleansing of the Russian population. So the unprovoked war of aggression by Russia was totally provoked every step of the way. Where are we now? Well, we don't know exactly. Something over 500,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed in this war. Contrary to the idiot propaganda of how Putin, if we let him take Ukraine, he's going to plow into Europe, he'll be marching in Germany. He hasn't even taken Kiev. Nancy Pelosi and Jill Biden and Kirsten Gillibrand, for all I know, can all go over to Kiev whenever they want. So the whole thing was a lie, but Biden tied himself to a victory of Ukraine against Russia. So Ukraine now did their great counteroffensive, and since they began the counteroffensive, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, is it accurate? I don't know. I think it may be close to accurate. Since the counteroffensive, Ukraine has lost 97,000 more soldiers. And now they are sending women to the front lines because they're out of men. So just at this moment when Joe Biden has tied himself to a victory of Ukraine against Russia, isn't it phenomenal that Hamas, funded by Bibi Netanyahu for years, suddenly gets across the border in Israel, which for some reason is not armed. They got rid of 2/3 of the military that was on that border, and commits a terroristic atrocity. And it is a terror atrocity, and I will not condemn that, but you also have to ask these questions. Bibi Netanyahu was on his way to jail with hundreds of thousands of IDF forces in the streets, objecting to his attempt to reform the criminal justice law so he could stay out of jail. We also know that a lot of the hostages, or would have been hostages, were killed by the Israeli army because apparently they have a policy of not protecting hostages. So if you know Hamas is somewhere, you go ahead and bomb and level the place whether there's people there or not. So there's a lot of evidence now coming out that many of the people that were killed were not only killed by Hamas, they were killed by the IDF. That still is not to say that that justifies by any means what occurred. But what do you have in response? What is Bibi Netanyahu doing in Gaza? Well, after this temporary ceasefire where they began getting 200 trucks of food and fuel into Gaza, where the normal amount before the war was over 500 trucks per day. So they had reduced their water and their fuel to less than 3% of what it was. Then for a brief period, they get it up to 40%. Now we're shelling again. We don't really know what the total death toll is. What they knew last I heard was somewhere over 15,000 Palestinians, including 8,000 children. And what some whistleblowers, according to a news source called 972, which is a group of Israelis and Palestinians, and there are people from the IDF who are saying that what Israel is doing is violating all of their old rules about combat to explicitly target civilians. And they're using AI. So it's a win-win for the crazy people at the Pentagon because they figured out how to pick 50 to 100 targets a day. So in the last 2 days, probably a few thousand, I've heard a couple hundred here, a couple hundred there. I don't know how many have been killed. Now, Is this good for the security of Israel? Is killing thousands of children going to make the world say, oh, those poor Israelis, we've got to really rally to their side? No, it is not. Is that known by the people that are encouraging and arming Netanyahu? Yes. Do you think Joe Biden gives a damn about Israel? He cares about Israel as much as he cares about Ukraine. So you can figure that out. How is this being played in the United States? And this gets back to my point about the divisions. So the thousands of people who are in the streets because they are upset about the genocide against children are being covered in the New York Post as being deranged pro-Hamas fanatics. So they say there's thousands of anti-Semites who think Israel should be wiped off the face of the earth, marching at every campus. And we should ban them. And they did. Columbia University, I need some water. Columbia University banned Jewish Voice for Peace, and they banned the Palestinian, pro-Palestinian group. Thanks. Now, what do they say to the people who are upset about the genocide? Because they're having all these pro-Israel demonstrations. So we're supposed to believe that everybody in the pro-Israel demonstration supports the mass murder of children and civilians. I don't think that's true. I know a lot of people in those demonstrations. Yes, you have crazy people who say, well, all the Palestinians are going to grow up to be terrorists and therefore we have to kill them. You have people who say that. You also have people in the pro-Palestine demonstrations who say that Israel should never exist. But that's not the majority view. But the win is that you ensure that none of these people ever talks to each other. And my point is, if the United States were the United States, first of all, the slaughter of children would stop immediately right now. We would stop this. But two, China, Russia, Brazil, South Africa, there was a resolution at the United Nations in 1967, which the whole world supported, UN Resolution 242 for a two-state solution. It's going to be very hard, and the more people who get killed, the harder it will be. But if the United States was functioning as a republic, an anti-colonial nation, then we could solve this. So the issue isn't sides. I went to hear my rotten congressman, Mike Lawler. He is horrible, horrible. And the area I live, Rockland County, is a very large majority Hasidic Jewish, a lot of them really pro-Israel, and a lot not actually, or at least a substantial. Anyway, I went to his town hall meeting, and you get there, and the police say, and they have gates dividing people, which side are you on, Palestine or Israel? And I said, well, I'm for peace. He said, well, you have to pick a side. You know, and that is the whole thing. Can't we just be for reason? Could we be for reason? Could we say that we think the slaughter should stop, that the 67 border should be respected, that as in Oslo, Arafat conceded that Israel had a right to exist, and Rabin conceded that there needed to be a Palestinian state, and they were going to figure out the borders, and they were going to green the deserts, and they were going to have economic development. So my point is, the problem is the United States. Now we have tremendous initiatives coming from China, from South Africa, from Brazil, from big countries with lots of people with significant scientific and technological capabilities. I think this is the reason why some African nations were willing to tell Victoria Nuland to take a hike when she came over there to tell them what to do. But is that enough to prevent thermonuclear war? I'm not sure. And that's why I'm saying I'm not sure that we will make it. I don't know. I don't think it's guaranteed. I think we could. I think the fact that you see thousands of young people in the streets who are convulsed about the genocide is important, but they don't know anything. Those of us who have been to these rallies have heard ad nauseum how the United States is evil and corrupt and has been exterminating the indigenous people forever, just like the Israelis. So these young people have no clue the power of the goodness of the United States. Were we perfect? No. Did Andrew Jackson march however many hundreds of thousands of Cherokee Native Americans to their death in his Trail of Tears? Yes, he did. Was Andrew Jackson on the side of the United States? No, he was not. He was a traitor. He was pro-British. He destroyed the Second National Bank. He did commit genocide. Was that the policy of the United States? I would say no. Was slavery the policy of the United States? I would say no. And I think Frederick Douglass agreed in his very long speech on what to the slave is the 4th of July. The intention expressed in our founding documents is true. The people who were supposed to uphold these principles were imperfect, and some were better than others. And our nation has not yet fully realized what it was intended to do. But the fact that we defeated the British Empire in 1783, after declaring our independence in 1776, the fact that we were the first country to succeed in defeating the British Empire that was around the whole world was a very big deal. And it was such a big deal that not one single head of state dared to visit us until the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876, because I think they all wanted to see if we were actually going to make it, or if they were going to get creamed because they dared to come over here. So the world is wondering if our nation is going to come back to its senses, if we are going to come back to the principles that it says, which are universal principles, not American principles, that every single person on this planet is born equal, that every single person on the planet has a relationship to the Creator, has a potential, has a spark of genius. And the whole point of government is to defend that and to allow that to develop. And one of the problems, getting back to what we have in the United States, where we threw everybody out of the mental hospitals, we threw them all in prison, they're homeless or wherever they are, is that we've decided a whole bunch of people are expendable. That somehow that they don't matter, that they have nothing to contribute, that it's not worth figuring out how someone who's currently incarcerated can actually become a productive member of society, or someone who currently is homeless. And by the way, New York City now, thanks to the flood of migrants who have been brought in, it was in 2018, 1 out of 10 children in the public schools in New York was homeless. Now it's 1 out of 9. And the homeless children are not sprinkled around the city. And it's not 1 out of 10 kids in every class. It's schools in Brooklyn, the Bronx. I talked to a semi-retired teacher who teaches science in Brooklyn. She said she's been in classes where over 50% or more of the students are homeless. that the smell of body odor is stifling because they cannot bathe. How can anyone learn? How can the children who are not homeless, let alone the ones who are homeless, become geniuses or develop their genius when they are in a classroom where they can't even breathe? And then we don't even have to talk about the next layer of this insanity, which is, if you think there's something wrong and you're not functioning well in this crazy class where everyone's homeless and you're acting like it's normal, probably you were born in the wrong body. And you should see the person who's going to tell you that you should change your gender. I mean, it's like one layer of insanity upon the next. And that's why the question is, I really have a question. Can we make it? I don't know. Can we make it? Will we make it? And that means fighting starting now. That's why, as Dennis said, my campaign, although I'm running for US Senate in New York, my campaign has to be a national campaign. We've started setting up committees, Friends of Diane Sare, and I think we're in about 15 or 16 states so far, because the policy that Lyndon LaRouche represented, which I am fighting for the United States to regain its identity, has to be the policy of our nation. And we have to make that hegemonic. And the American people have to decide that any candidate for office who's not going to stand for that is going to be run out of town on a rail. It just, we can't put up with this crap anymore. You can't say, oh, well, I'll support so-and-so because they're the, no. You say your campaign is absurd. It's a lie. I'm going to write in my dog's name. I'm not voting for this. I'm not going to be complicit in this. And then what is needed, number one, LaRouche used to talk about Glass-Steagall. Why do we need Glass-Steagall, the separation of the banks? Because we have to put this rotten 2 quadrillion bubble that is crashing, we have to write it off. We cannot pay this debt. They can charge you $80 an hour to plug a meter in Binghamton. And guess what? They're not going to be able to pay the debt. They can charge you $15,000 per quarter on your property taxes. It is not going to pay the debt. It's over. It's out of whack. People who are working as home health aides get paid barely minimum wage. They do backbreaking labor that people's lives depend on. Can they, on 40 hours a week, rent an apartment anywhere? Is that not insane? So the first thing is that this whole rotten system has to be put through bankruptcy reorganization. The Federal Reserve has to be shut down, and we have to have a national bank. And the national bank has to be run, as it says in our Constitution, by the Congress, which has to be held to account by the American people. And everyone can sit back and complain, but as George Washington said in his farewell address, the American people have an enormous amount of power. We just haven't used it. We haven't been using it since the 60s, since our leaders were assassinated. No one ever bothered to find out who killed President Kennedy, for example. There was a Warren Commission report about a bullet that went like that, and everyone said, oh yeah, we're sure that's what happened. We know it, okay, we're gonna, and then Malcolm X gets killed, Martin Luther King gets killed, Robert Kennedy gets killed. Anyone do anything about it? No. Wasn't important, we never got to the bottom of it. Then they railroad Lyndon LaRouche into prison. They shut down publications with 250,000 subscribers. They give his associates 77-year jail sentences, but the news media said, well, you know, he was a fringe candidate. He was a political extremist. And, you know, I don't think I liked him. No, I never read anything by him, but all right, so we let that go. Then we had the 9/11 attacks. 3,000 approximately Americans were killed on that day. Somehow Osama bin Laden and his entire family gets flown out of the United States the next day when no one else can get on an airplane. And we all say, oh yeah, we're sure that someone over in Pakistan did this to us. We never bother to find out who in the United States would have the power to take down our security. And Lyndon LaRouche warned, if you go running off and start bombing poor nations and don't look within at who actually had the capability of doing that, then they will be there waiting to do it again. So in effect, since the Kennedy assassinations, the people who did that have been running our nation. And what I'm saying is, if we don't end that now, then I don't know if the world is going to make it. And therefore, it really depends on us, and it really depends on this campaign for US Senate. And for this campaign to be successful, it means that I have to get on the ballot, and I don't expect them to let me get on the ballot this time. I expect dirty tricks. People might remember when we were petitioning last time, I made a point. I never announced on the Zoom call. We had Zoom meetings every night. I never told anyone how many signatures we had, because we were trying to get 2,000 a day, but I never said we've got 47,000. I didn't want anyone to know, because I knew there were sneaky agents coming up to all of our petitioning teams. Oh, how's it going? How's she doing? And when we got near the end, what started happening? People would come up to our volunteers in front of the grocery store, grab the clipboard, throw it on the ground, and go in and tell the manager we were assaulting them. In other words, once they figured out that we were about to do it, we got all kinds of harassment. We were getting thrown off places. We were having people grab the clipboards. I hired a security guard to guard the petitions 24 hours a day, and we managed to get on. I don't think they intend to let that happen again. So we have to be really tough. We really have to be a team. We really have to know that crazy things are going to happen. We have to not be fazed. But more importantly than the petitioning, we have to get a change in the US now, because thousands of people are dying in the world. I didn't even talk about South Sudan, where 6,700 children are being displaced every day. And 350,000 children have just lost their homes in South Sudan. You don't hear a word about it. So we are responsible for this. Everyone here and everyone who's not here is also responsible. Now, I want to take questions. I want to say a little about the petitioning, but I actually wanted you to hear from Lyndon LaRouche. Everyone here did not have the good fortune and privilege that I did to know him personally for so many years. You were not going to see him on the mainstream press. So I took this speech, which I think was delivered in January or February of 2000 in Massachusetts. And I think you'll get an idea of who the man was, if we can go to that.
Does the United States still have the function of being a temple of liberty and beacon of hope for these nations of the world? And can we do that by making sure we do it also internally, to restore the nation internally as a temple of liberty and beacon of hope, in order to give it the moral authority to be a temple of liberty and beacon of hope worldwide? Could it be done? Yes, it could be done. Let's take a case of my own and Helga's and our friends' foreign policy, which we've been practicing. This is not something we dreamed up, it's something we've been practicing. I tried to, when, you know, it's out of New Hampshire, when the New Hampshire primary campaign in 1980, when I was sitting at a table at a gun club event, which had about 2,500 people up there in Concord area, at the what used to be the old New Hampshire Highway Hotel. And because we were arranged at the table as presidential candidates in alphabetical order by surname, Ronald Reagan was at the end of the table and I was next to him. And you had all these other funny fellows there too. So Ronald and I got into a little bit of discussion. There wasn't much substance to it. It was just a discussion. But I saw it when he put his speech together, a 5-minute speech, which we were each allotted to do. I saw the way he did it and realized the man is not as dumb as he was supposed to be. He had problems, but he wasn't stupid. And I recognized that from talking to him. So when he became president or had been elected, then I got into a conversation with some of the people who were going to form, or in the process of forming, the new administration as a Democrat. And they say, well, what's your agenda? You know how politicians talk. And a whole bunch of them, including Richard Richards and so forth, what's your agenda? So I would discuss with these people the things that I thought the United States ought to do. And they would say, we like that, we don't like that, we like that, we don't like that. So we would go around. Helga went with me to some of these meetings, and we'd meet various people. And we talked with the Democrats. I would say, look, to the Democrats, leading Democrats in the Congress, this is the way I think we ought to deal with the Reagan administration. We ought to move quickly because there's some bad things over there, but we ought to move quickly to find common denominators which are good for the nation and get this thing going in that direction now. Well, one of the results was that at the end of 1981, I had a project, and the question was discussing with the Russians, the Soviets then. So to make short of the thing, I got involved on behalf of the Reagan administration in discussing with the representatives of the top Soviet circles on my policy for dealing with the weapons crisis and related matters. So that led to eventually, about a year later, to Reagan making the famous speech announcing his SDI on March 23rd, 83. Now that went awry afterward, and I was out of the picture soon because the enemies of mine got into it pretty quick, and they made a mess of it. So what they're talking about missile defense systems today is mostly nonsense, even though there were some people in the background who knew what we were talking about. But in some of that time and earlier businesses and dealing with non-aligned nations and developing nations generally, I've been pretty much involved with the question of foreign policy matters over a period of about at least 3 decades. And I know a lot of people, if you look at some of my endorsements of various parts of the world, from leading figures from South America, Europe, Asian countries, and so forth, you'll see a reflection of the fact that I have been a significant figure on their horizon in terms of relations with the United States and others over this period of time. And in many of these countries, there are people who wish I were president. They think it'd be good for them and good for the world, and they say so. So I know these countries. I know what we can do. And I know that if I were president, I could deal with this problem. The problem is that we must have an emergency action to put the present monetary system, which isn't functioning, into bankruptcy reorganization by governments, by sovereign governments. In other words, we all agree that each government will take its chunk of the problem and they'll put that chunk through their own bankruptcy reorganization. But they will coordinate our efforts to get something out of this which will be stable for all of us. Now, obviously, if you're going to make a sudden move like that, you've got to base your move on something which is a proven precedent. You can't come up with some completely newfangled thing that nobody ever heard of before and expect the people, as well as the politicians, to suddenly accept that as a plan of action. You've got to say, here's where we went wrong. Here's where we were doing things that were working, relatively speaking, and here's where we went wrong and we began to do the wrong thing. That's why we're in the mess. Now let's go back to the point in the road where we made the wrong turn, and let's begin to move from there. So this idea of a new Bretton Woods is very simple. We had from 44 through 58 and somewhat beyond, we had, with all its faults, we had a monetary system and a general economic policy which worked. It may not have worked the way we liked it, but it worked relative to anything we've seen since. We had recovery of the world from the war, economic recovery. We had the Marshall Plan. We had a rebuilding of the United States economy based largely upon Marshall Plan exports into Europe. So we built up our industries in helping Europe develop and Japan develop through Marshall Plan cooperation and through that kind of policy, through the Bretton Woods agreements, the old Bretton Woods agreements. sovereign nation state, gold reserve, fixed parities, tariffs which were protective for all countries, each and all countries, trade agreements of that type, and so forth. Low interest, long-term loans to promote international trade, and that sort of thing. It worked. With all the failures, it worked. With all the problems, it worked, relative to anything we've seen since 1971. If we had never stopped doing that, we wouldn't have the world financial and economic crisis or the US crisis we have today. So it should be obvious to nations who've gone through this kind of experience of the present IMF system. They all know it doesn't work. They all know it's destroying us. Well, let's get rid of it. Well, you don't ask one nation by itself to get rid of it. You try to get a group of nations together to say, we will jointly agree this thing has to go. And if you have the majority of the human race in the deal with you, it's likely to fly. And if the United States is a partner in it, the President of the United States, it's likely to fly. Particularly if the American people at that time perceive a major crisis which needs some fixing. And our argument to the American people is, this is what worked. We've got the facts to prove it. You've got senior citizens who remember how it worked, who can remind you of it and tell you about it. That worked. What you're doing now has failed. Now let's gently go back to the turn of the road where we made the wrong turn. Go back to the Bretton Woods model, maybe change the relations among states a bit, but do basically the same thing. Go in the same direction. Learn the lessons of the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s, and go back to that. Now, what does that mean? As I dealt with this yesterday in a press conference in Concord, where the question came up, particularly from one of our friends who is in the machine tool area. How do we do this? Well, I said that you can't just have an economy and say, set up a master plan of how it's going to work and have it work. You've got to have a national mission. You've got to have a sense of purpose. What are you going to do? Where are you going to go? Well, the general condition of this planet is as follows. Presuming we've gone back to the old Bretton Woods model or something like it, same principles, the same general idea. Now, how are we going to build our way globally out of the crisis? How are we going to have a mutual advantage, China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, South America, Central America, Europe, the United States? How are we going to have a deal that is equitable to all? What do we have to do? Well, the basic problem on the planet is that when Roosevelt died, we didn't do what he intended to do. That is to rip up all vestiges of Portuguese, Dutch, British, and French colonialism and imperialism, and end the domination of this planet by a free trade system. That was Roosevelt's intention, as he stated plainly and repeatedly to Winston Churchill. But when Roosevelt died, Winston Churchill won, and the Washington gang took orders from Churchill, along with the people who worked for the Churchill, and they put the policy in. So as a result of that, we did not address the question which Roosevelt intended to do, is to transform what had been the colonial region of the world, or semi-colonial, under free trade domination and looting, and transform this into a collection of sovereign nation-state republics, which would be in partnership with the United States in particular, as well as Europe, and to try to build this world up so that you had a just economic conditions throughout the world as a whole, to bring nations together as sovereign nation states so we would not create a situation where we look forward, in Roosevelt's view and mine at the time when I was in service, to look forward to a world where we wouldn't have another terrible world war.